So I'm Gabi Mayer, and I teach in modern languages, German. So I'm very excited to have Lynn Kutch here because she's doing something I'm researching right now, German comics and social justice. Lynn Kutch is professor of German at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches all levels of German courses, as well as a first-year seminar course dealing with global citizenship. Additionally, she is the newly named coordinator of undergraduate research and creativity at Kutztown University. Her research interests have focused on German crime fiction, representations of the European refugee crisis in art and pop culture, and comics studies. Her article on teaching the graphic version of Kafka's Metamorphosis won the American Association of Teachers for Germans journal Praxis Best Article Prize for 2015. She also published the collected volume Novel Perspectives on German language graphic novels, History, Pedagogy, Theory in 2016. She's the co-founder and co-coordinator of the German Studies Association's Comic Studies Network, which is the biggest conference for German studies, and the creator of a comprehensive archive on graphic novels and comics that serves as a valuable resource for researchers and teachers alike. Lynn's talk today will address the issues of social justice and identity in 3 German-speaking graphic novels. Please join me in welcoming Lynn Kutch.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Thanks also for the invitation. And this is, we were talking earlier, this is a little bit of a new approach to these graphic novels. I hadn't thought about them in quite this way before. So, wir werden sichtbar, that means we become visible. This line from Jenny Erpenbeck's 2015 migrant narrative, Gehen, ging, gegangen, or Go, went, gone, sets the tone. Making the invisible visible. A simple web search of this phrase yields a variety of book titles, initiatives, and awareness campaigns about social injustice and human rights abuses. One art installation in particular of the same name, Making the Invisible Visible, illustrates these points with a strikingly 3-dimensional method. The artist has transformed large portraits of each individual into segmented strips that are applied to slats of fences. At first, the images aren't readily visible and only come into focus from extreme angles. Related to comics and superheroes, here, in a much more lower-tech way, we can see the cross-section of an underrepresented population for whom this well-known character fights. This initial and nearly universal recognition of Superman may make it easier to imagine or even accept this notion of comics paired with social justice. In the US, many would argue the birthplace and permanent residence of comics. American superheroes have traditionally fought for justice and advocating for disadvantaged populations by depicting both sides in exaggerated ways. For example, Captain America's creators invented him as a direct response to the rise of fascism in the Third Reich, and here you see Captain America physically punching recognizable Nazis. In the lower third, though, his shield deflects an enemy bullet, while readers are also introduced to fresh-faced Bucky in the midst of all this action. In another striking example of utilizing the comic medium to speak out about social issues, DC's Green Lantern and Green Arrow series confronted the epidemic of drug addiction. In the abstract submitted for this talk, I claimed that recent work in comic studies has confirmed the medium's aptitude for encouraging critical dialogue and political engagement. But the archetypal artistic and editorial choices listed above, as well as a persistent opposition to comics as serious art, have predictably led to questions about comics' aptitude or even authority to tackle weighty social issues. 2 domestic topical examples of the opposition to comic books treading into political engagement territory underscore this questioning of the medium's authority to, or even good business practice of, confronting social justice issues. First, following news of his 2017 death, one of Stan Lee's 1968 columns from Stan's Soapbox went viral. And in that he said, "Racism and bigotry are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. But unlike a team of costume supervillains, they can't be halted with a punch in the snoot or a zap from a ray gun. The only way to destroy them is to expose them, to reveal them for the insidious evil they really are." As a member of the opposition, DC comics artist Ethan Van Sciver explains the philosophy behind Comicsgate, which he describes as a consumer-led revolt against what is clearly a left-wing dominance in the comic book industry. It's an opportunity for creators to create again, free from the oppressive social justice warrior harassment and blacklisting that made work difficult or impossible for them. A second example of opposition, or at least strongly worded skepticism, is an excerpt of commentary that aired on Bill Maher's HBO show. Although this is the opinion of one talk show host, postings in many web forums indicate that his views, whoops, oh, I have a different view up here. Sorry, that his views may be representative of popular opinion. That's a different view that I'm seeing. Okay. Go there. So this is the clip from Bill Maher. There we go. Thank you.
And finally, to every person on social media who's asked me since November, Bill, what do you have to say about Stan Lee? And every paparazzi outside a restaurant who's still shouting at me, Bill, what about the Stan Lee thing? Okay, your day has come. Tonight's editorial is about Stan Lee, who, if you missed it, died in November. And a few days later, I posted a blog that was in no way an attack on Mr. Lee, but took the occasion of his death to express my dismay at people who think comic books are literature and superhero movies are great cinema.
I want to stop. Okay. I want to stop that clip. Okay. So what I wanted to stop it at people who think comic books are literature. So his criticism of misguided people who think comic books are literature segues into a debate about comics in the German-speaking realm, where the marked divide that still exists between high and low culture prompted the Comics Manifesto, comics are art, in all caps. The undersigned demanded that the comics be afforded the same respect as literature and the visual arts. A single panel cartoon by German comics artist Flix demonstrates the joy he and other artists felt when comics finally earned space at the iconic and prestigious Frankfurter Buchmesse, or the book fair that takes place in Frankfurt, where comics were not represented up until recently. And this is Flix, what he looks like. All of these preliminary observations and inquiries have moved us closer to the topic at hand. Okay. How does or can the German comics tradition fit into the International Comic Artist Social Justice League? Okay, I'm glad you like that. I enjoyed making that too. At a comics-focused German Studies Association panel last September here in Pittsburgh, an audience member asked, why aren't there any German superheroes? What are your thoughts on that? This won't be totally interactive, but why aren't there any German superheroes? You might say there are, but his question was, why aren't there? And then I'll tell you what I found out. Well, that's the thing. Yeah, that's. So do you know some that?
It would be too much like an Uberbitch, right?
And that's okay. You'll see that in a few. Yeah, right. So the history, but then there were some. So we'll go through, since you both alluded to things that I'm going to show you here. So why aren't there any German superheroes? Here's a very brief history of German superheroes. Very brief. Why aren't there any German superheroes? Marvel's Nightcrawler, said to be from a small Bavarian village, first appeared in 1975. Marvel's Blitzkrieg, I know, I didn't want to know this stuff, but made a brief appearance in the mid-1980s, but he is not to be confused with DC's Baron Blitzkrieg, maybe that's who you were thinking of, I don't know, who had a remarkably long lifespan from 1977 to 2006. Of course, our initial observation here is what we mentioned. These are American versions of German superheroes, or maybe anti-heroes. What creations, if any, have appeared from within the German-speaking world? Contributions to an online comics forum produced these results. There may be more that I don't know about. At the height of the American comics boom in the 1950s, German comics readers experienced Sigurd, a hero based on old Germanic traditions, and thus not situated in the present that took on bigotry, racism, or the drug crisis. Other contributors to the online forum mentioned Old Shatterhand, who accompanies Winnetou, the Wild West theme novels, comics, and films. And then someone else mentioned Perry Rodan, a cosmonaut, who will appear here as the final example of a German comic superhero from the 1960s. These examples, and perhaps our own speculations about the influence of German historical peculiarities, such as the exploitation of the Übermensch concept and the cult heroism of Hitler, may lead us to the common conclusion that there never could really be, this clicker isn't working anymore, never could really be, no, it's not at all. Okay, sorry, not advancing. Just as a side note, while we're waiting, this is an interesting website, Drawception. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of that, but they'll just put a theme out there, and people just draw whatever the theme was. This was Hitler superhero. I know, it's just advance. I'm just trying to advance. Okay, that's where we are. Is it going to go now? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Arrow keys, okay.
Right, yeah, that's what I did. Okay. Anyway, so the closest we have gotten to the national hero over the past 10 years may be this, Super Merkel. And there are a couple different ones that you can find. I used this one for a poster for my race and gender in Germany class. But unfortunately, many have since demonized her, mainly because of her open border policies, a concept that returns us to the central idea of making once invisible groups visible. So this is, again, from this Drawception page, which was Merkel as villain. That was the, so here's Angela Merkel as a villain. I've been expecting you with her cat. It's the idea of her being demonized, that now we're back to really no German superheroes. This idea that she's been criticized for making the invisible visible. Many would argue that the social issues and policy decisions regarding immigration have increased the instances of racism and bigotry in Germany that Stan Lee had addressed in a different historical and cultural context. It is precisely these topics that the comics artists under consideration today have expanded on in order to make the invisible visible and give the voiceless voice and agency. In the sense of arts activism, which I will discuss in more detail below, the three artists step in to take the unlikely roles of social justice heroes in that they share the common goals of raising awareness and consciousness, as well as motivating readers to promote social change. The remainder of the talk will address the questions of how the three comics artists in their comics that you see here can achieve these goals, and if or how they succeed. Here are the three main questions that will guide the closer readings of the three texts. And they're up here too, so you can read along. So the first question, how do the artists participate in critical attunement, or a method of working with marginalized, disempowered people and communities in order to restore agency and transformation? 2, how do the artists display reflexivity, or their awareness of themselves as artists and their recognition and evaluation of their own actions? In other words, how does each of them as white Germans not only lend agency and voice to their comics characters, but evaluate that process? And 3rd, how do their contributions participate in the social imagination, also conceptualized as an awareness of what it means to be of the world? What contributions do they make to social justice? Before we move into the detailed readings of the verbal and visual aspects that comprise these texts, I would like to offer an overview of 2 key theories, aesthetic pedagogy and arts activism. Kelly W. Guyot characterizes aesthetic pedagogy as a philosophy that studies artistic making, perception, and affect as a means of understanding experiences, and the meaning of those experiences as connecting and awakening individuals to and with the world. Framing her own understanding of the concept within Maxine Green's seminal work, Releasing the Imagination, Guyot further explains aesthetic pedagogy as using imaginative imaginative capacities to bring ethical concerns to the forefront. Arts activism, on the other hand, involves many of the same principles, but propels art beyond pedagogical territory and into the public social consciousness as an inspired expression of citizenship. Arts activism is about the artistry of social consciousness grounded in human interaction. It represents an innovative use of public space to address contested issues of socio-political and cultural significance allied with systems of power and control. Arts activism combines a call for action with doing and involves the three-pronged approach of relationality. How might arts and the social imagination inspire wide awakeness in others? Criticality, to extend imagination's purpose not to resolve, but to awaken. And responsibility, rethinking art and engagement to break habits of stasis. The artist's chosen themes and approaches to these topics strongly suggest that all three regard their art as a participatory social act, and our closer analyses will examine how they deploy their styles to awaken and to make something visible that has been rendered invisible. So what, for the three, getting a preview of the three, what has been invisible, not that they now try to make visible? What has been invisible that they now try to make visible? What has been invisible that they now try to make visible? Our first example is the 2016 prize-winning comic Maggio by Birgit Raya, who presents a relatively unknown chapter of German history, namely the experiences of Mozambican guest workers who relocated to East Germany between 1979 and 1989. Hopefully, this will be okay. So I have a few clips. There's German narration. It doesn't matter if you don't understand German because you can still see. No. It's a very hard thing to use. It was there, and then I think it went away.
Wie fühlt es sich an in der Fremde, dort, wo einen niemand versteht und so vieles anders ist als zu Hause? Die Comicautorin Birgit Raya erzählt in Maggio die Geschichte jener rund 20.000 Mosambikaner, die in den 80er Jahren als Vertragsarbeiter in die DDR kamen. Aus bitterer Armut hin zu den sozialistischen Brüdern. Zuerst muss es wohl ein Kulturschock gewesen sein.
During that time, approximately 20,000 citizens of Mozambique lived and worked in East Germany, attracted by the promise of financial gain and education, as well as by the opportunity to escape the civil war at home. Not surprisingly, many soon realized that the East German state regarded them as little more than a source of cheap labor. After 1989, most Maggioranas, a combination of made in Germany and mad Germans, returned to Mozambique where they learned that their expected wages had disappeared into the coffers of the Mozambican state.
Nur wer sich selbst neue Arbeit besorgt, darf bleiben, die anderen müssen zurück. In Mosambik folgt eine böse Überraschung. Jener Teil des Lohnes, den die DDR als finanzielle Vorsorge gezahlt hatte, ist verschwunden. Die Menschen stehen mit
worden und waren sehr isoliert.
ein seltsames Leben, am Rande der DDR-Gesellschaft, als Arbeitskraft gefragt, nicht als gleichberechtigter Mitbürger. Es gibt Ausgehverbote, Schwangerschaften sind nicht erwünscht, statt der versprochenen Ausbildung werden Stellen zugeteilt. Dann bricht der Staat zusammen und die verordnete Solidarität bröckelt.
Die meisten waren enttäuscht natürlich, dass es so abrupt bleibt.
So on the larger idea of how Raya uses her art to raise social consciousness, remember guiding question number one, which is the one about critical attunement, the method of working with marginalized groups to restore agency. Just as verbal literary works exhibit distinct styles, so do comics. For each of the three artists, we will take into account this aesthetic style as a way to read their process of cultural attunement. So even a cursory look at the book, and we saw with the clips into the pages of the book. Here we can see kind of a summary picture of what all the artwork looks like. it makes it clear that Vaya draws upon African and perhaps specifically Mozambican artistic styles that have influenced her choices for splash pages throughout, as well as the coloration, which is limited to, as you can see, 3 or 4 distinct shades. Choosing a notably African style, she can situate the characters in their home traditions. It could appear, as my colleague Brett Sterling argues, that the use of African art and artifacts only reinforces the historical imbalance of power between Europe and Africa, without expressly commenting on, in Sterling's words, that the former had plundered art from the latter, and European museums continue to resist repatriating artworks in their countries of origin. Sterling continues, Vaya has said that she has modeled her work on modeled her style on the work of Southern African artists, but without signaling that specific aesthetic tradition, they emerge as cultural appropriation or cliché. Using a selection of splash pages to make my point, I would like to take a different approach and demonstrate that Vaya does deploy the typically African art, but as a kind of background or visual foil against which the guest workers can evaluate aspects of their identity and their adjustment or maladjustment in their new home. So we'll take a look at it. With this splash page, which means a full page with no panels, it can be across center, it can be across 2 pages, it can be a full page like this. That combines typically African and German icons, along with the question, was ist Heimat, what is home? Vaya establishes this recurring motif of Heimat, identity, and conflicting identity questions. This example shows recognizable African art paired with the words, Werde ich mich hier jemals heimisch fühlen? Will I ever feel at home here? As a side note, the bird, in many different forms, also serves as a motif throughout the work. So that would be something else to look at if you were to study Maggio. In this splash page, Vaya uses the motifs of African masks and other traditional dress to punctuate one worker's observation that he does not sleep near the window because of the demons who come in the night and vergiften deine Seele, or poison your soul. Another example is accompanied by the words, Der Schmerz wollte einfach nicht nachlassen, the pain would just not let up. Here the character has just gone through a negative experience in his private life, and the pain has been brought about by 2 other Mozambican citizens close to him. This final example, although there are many more, shows the character's reactions to the anti-foreigner demonstration, fires, and terrorization by neo-Nazi groups that escalated in 1990. Vaya represents his feelings with these visual choices accompanied by the words, zum ersten Mal in meinem Leben hatte ich wirklich Angst. For the first time in my life, I was really scared. In a more fine-tuned response to our guiding question regarding how the artist practices cultural attunement, I would argue that her infusion of African art ideals facilitates her work with the story of marginalized people and offers them agency by allowing them to express feelings related to their identities and their experiences in Germany, but through a visual framework linked to their identities in their home country. Sterling dismisses the use of the African art by saying that she does not reference her sources, but I view this method as illustrative of the uneven power dynamic and the inability for the African guest workers to locate themselves in a German paradigm. On the other hand, if we do accept the style as hopelessly stereotypical, this can also support the idea that the Maggioranas can never really gain full agency because of limiting stereotypical frameworks that the dominant culture imposes. The guiding question number 2, how does she evaluate her process of awarding voice and agency? Sterling also addressed this idea in his GSA paper. This reading of the comic, with its emphasis on the primacy of a non-German perspective, is suggested in the comic's prologue. Here the artist's alter ego explains how, during a visit to Mozambique, she encountered a merchant who had lived in the GDR many years before. Fascinated by the experience, the author began to research and interview individuals for the content of Maggioranas. The claim that the comic allows the Maggioranas to speak for themselves is reinforced visually by a series of panels depicting the artist conducting interviews, and especially in a panel featuring a recording device and list of interview questions. The visual symbol of the recorder suggests to the reader or viewer that this comic contains the true story of individuals presented in their own words. Sterling argues that the comic's claim that claim to authenticity is abruptly undermined when the narration explains that those painstakingly researched stories have been compiled into those of 3 fictional characters. So she took all the words, all the interview results of the real people and made them into 3 composite figures. Sterling claims that the imposition of editorial control onto these narratives entails alteration of the lived experiences documented by the artist, which again replicates the historical phenomenon of white dominance of black narratives. Sterling makes a convincing point, but when we read these choices within the context of arts activism, Via does in fact provide agency and empowerment and realizes social justice by rendering experiences socially intelligible and recognizable. She uses her art as a means for her readers to understand these experiences and connect to these characters, even if they are represented through composite characters, which is a separate argument. The next comic, Eichmeyer and Borsel's 2017 graphic novel, Liebe deine Nächsten, or Love Thy Neighbor, serves as a sort of graphic diary chronicling the couple's 3 weeks aboard a rescue ship in the Mediterranean. 3 weeks that taught them personally, as it mentioned, and nicht eine anonyme Masse, these are people and not an anonymous man.
Es sind Menschen. Man sieht ihre Wünsche, man sieht ihre Geschichte und man lernt sie ja wirklich kennen. Sie sind nicht eine anonyme Masse, sie sind Individuen.
In the book's foreword, Eichmeyer writes that he and Borsel did not base their title on the biblical reference that might instantly spring to mind, love your neighbor. Instead, they replicated the title of Erich Maria Remarque's 1939 novel of the same name, Liebe deine Nächsten, about German refugees fleeing the Third Reich. Significantly, the 1941 English translation of the novel is flotsam, a term commonly defined as debris in the water that was not deliberately thrown overboard, but rather often as a result of a shipwreck or accident. In everyday speech, the word has acquired other connotations in addition to the maritime definition. For example, useless or unimportant items, or a vagrant, penniless population. All 3 facets of that definition apply to the refugees who continue to travel across the Mediterranean in precarious rubber boats and are dismissed as unwanted and inferior. In capturing these aspects, Eichmeyer's and Borsel's book serves the principles of arts activism by taking on characteristics of documentary photography or photojournalism, a method that, like bias, makes these experiences intelligible and recognizable. So guiding question number 1, the one about critical attunement. Eichmeyer's method of working with marginalized and disempowered people and restoring agency emerges through his style that I have labeled as a kind of comic documentary, a genre that blends elements and techniques from visual art, documentary photography, photojournalism, and even classic literature. But how specifically does Eichmeyer move the reader to a visual truth, which is expected of photojournalism?
Mitgefühl für die Flüchtlinge.
Although Eichmeyer provides many examples in his book of pictures that take on the same characteristics of news stories, like these that were shown in this clip, his pictures aim to stir empathy. So, as for example, with these portrait approach. So he uses the method of portrait photography, which serves the dual purpose of presenting visual evidence of a person and also telling a story about the framed person. With most of these, that one's pretty short, but with a lot of them he has almost a full-page life story of the person that he sketched. These methods and examples, like bias, emphasize the relational aspect, or how the collective is embedded in individual experience. Guiding question 2 was, how does the artist display his awareness as an artist in the process? One clear example of his role as an artist is the shift from computer coloration to hand coloration, which we just looked at. Another more active approach, beyond simply providing pictures that ultimately are left open for interpretation, that Eichmeyer uses, is providing longer pieces of text, throughout the book, in which he articulates statistics such as information on inequality of wealth in the entire world. He also offers personal commentary. Jeder hat das Recht, ohne Angst und Not, am Leben in Frieden zu leben. Everyone has the right to live a peaceful life, free of fear and want. And he clearly stated in an interview that no one deserves to drown in the Mediterranean. By documenting his own experience aboard a rescue ship, he expands the definition of participatory art. He does not just inform based on newspaper articles and television news accounts. Instead, he reports from inside the community of rescue workers and refugees themselves. He also offers concrete suggestions for how people can help, namely donating to SOS Mediterranean, which is the group with whom he worked. So he certainly combines the call for action with doing. Although it might seem that he, like a photographer, simply sketches pictures, his detailed description of his artistic process and his inclusion of, these also appear in the book, these austere sketches and finished color products, indicates that by filling in these characters with color, he becomes closer to understanding them.
Stand der Reportagecomic Im Land der Frühaufsteher. Seit Jahren verfolgt Bulling die Flüchtlingspolitik des Landes Sachsen-Anhalts. Sie lernte Asylbewerber kennen und dokumentierte, was einem droht, wenn man gezwungenermaßen nach Deutschland flieht.
As you see, the artist working directly, interacting a lot with the communities. Like Vaya, Bulling limits her coloring to no more than 3 dominant colors, as this picture shows. She focuses very much on the individuals, but her work seems to have developed from the injustices that the severe, far-removed dwellings symbolically represent. So guiding question number 1, how does Bulling perform critical attunement? She does this broadly by producing a graphic novel that seeks to draw attention to injustice against Black asylum seekers, and she has stated this goal explicitly. At the same time, Bulling embeds a certain ambivalence into her graphic novel, in which she is often made to feel uncomfortable as a member of the dominant culture. One example early on, which we'll examine in more depth as part of the roundtable tomorrow, is a scene in which she enters an Afro shop, as it's called in the novel, where the African males who frequent the shop interrogate her about her presence there. In another example, which we will also examine more closely tomorrow, she has dinner with an African group of friends in their dwelling, but feels every bit the outsider because of language and cultural differences. Even by showing this dynamic, however, she performs a critical attunement by emphasizing the alienation and separateness that the Africans experience in the culturally isolated spaces of the Afro shop or in the residences. Bulling nonetheless highlights and foregrounds her work with this community and calls attention to racism within German society toward asylum seekers, as shown by direct comments made by other Germans, where here they're asking how do they get to the Asylantenheim, to the home where the asylum seekers are, and she says, are you sure you want to go there? And then she tells them how to get there, but the older woman is baffled that they even want to go out there. Or by commenting on restrictive legal regulations for the asylum seekers. As Brett Sterling has argued, the comic points regularly to the existence of white privilege, the freedom of movement, the expectation of physical security, and the ability to choose what injustices one will care about. Bulling presents an inside look at this problem using the motif of the homes themselves to thematize and draw attention to the isolation and alienation of the asylum seekers who sometimes live there for years with no authorization to work or opportunity to become organically integrated into German culture. Guiding question 2, how does she evaluate her own process as an artist? By adding the character of Paula, Bulling foregrounds her own role as witness, reporter, and producer of narrative. She comments on her own deliberate choices and how to portray the asylum seekers. She also alludes to the criticism that has, since the refugee crisis in Germany, of the Gutmensch, which is the do-gooder, which is a negative thing, loosely related to the often pejorative term social justice warrior. I think Gutmensch and social justice warrior, which is never meant as a good thing, during a protest in which she takes part. A former roommate of hers that she happens to meet criticizes her way of giving voice to the refugees, where he says, you are producing white pictures of Black people. With this reproach, bullying not only indicates a very important self-reflexive step in her own storytelling process, but also the relative failure to be the voice for the invisible group. Nonetheless, she also provides an example of fully participatory art that provides agency and empowerment to the populations by bringing their stories into focus and making them visible. That was more of a protest. So I've saved the last guiding question to answer by way of conclusion to the three separate yet related discussions. And that third question was, how do their contributions participate in the social imagination or awareness of what it means to be of the world? To return to our initial thoughts on making the invisible visible, and the example of the art installation that we saw at the beginning that featured transformed large portraits into segmented strips, at first the images aren't readily visible, only come into focus from extreme angles. I would argue here that although the novels do not display the kind of prominence that a life-size art installation would on a busy street, the comics artists bring their subjects into focus from extreme graphic angles. As Donovan and Abreu argue, graphic novels are tools that effectively communicate what are often unrepresentable and unspeakable traumatic experiences. Williams writes about autobiographical comics, but his analysis is also fitting here. Comics are a type of symbolic creativity that helps form identity, a way to reconstruct the world, placing fragments of testimony into meaningful narrative and physically reconstructing a damaged body. We have looked closely at the nature of the fragments of testimony that each author extends. Each of them, in an arts activism way, acknowledges difference so that minority voices are not subsumed but heard. And like literary authors, each has his or her own style that they have reflexively developed to represent visually complex art and emotionally overwhelming experiences. From Vida's repurposing of African art iconography to examine identity, to Ike Meyer's watercolors that articulate emotion, to Bulling's representation of human pain through cement high-rises and isolated atmospheres, all three artists at least attempt to express the traumatic experiences of socially and politically marginalized individuals. Popular commentary on the three graphic novels would indicate that they all succeed at fostering an interconnectedness between humans and through art. They all gesture toward empathy. These are some descriptors that have been used to describe all three of these novels: the feeling, moving stories.
Man denkt sich, das kann ja nicht sein, dass diese Menschen nun wirklich einfach ertrinken und dass sich kein Mensch darum kümmern will oder dass es eigentlich verdrängt wird. Wenn man dann wirklich dieses Schlauchboot dort im Meer sieht und wenn man dann wirklich diese Menschen sieht, die dann hochkommen auf das Schiff, dann kann man eigentlich erst erahnen, wie es wirklich war. Also mir kommt erst wirklich das Gefühl dafür.
Nach Mosambik.
Birgit Weil schildert all das in 3 fiktiven Biografien auf der Basis vieler Interviews mit Vertragsarbeitern, die sie getroffen hat. Sie macht das einfühlsam und berührend und verhilft den Maggio so auch zu ein bisschen Anerkennung.
And Bulling, as a curious observer, hopes to use her work to spread the word, maybe even to unaffected politicians.
Paula Bulling erzählt aus der Perspektive einer neugierigen Beobachterin, die sich ihren Protagonisten langsam und behutsam annähert. So entsteht ein eindringliches Bild vom destruktiven Alltag der Asylbewerber, deren Schicksal viele deutsche Politiker bis heute unberührt lässt.
The evaluation of a real contribution to social justice is different for every reader, but the artists, as evidenced in interviews, attempt, in Maxine Green's words, not to resolve, but to awaken, to disclose the ordinarily unseen, unheard, and unexperienced. The arts, it has been said, cannot change the world, but they may change human beings who might change the world. This does not directly answer the question posed above, whether comics have the aptitude or authority to tackle weighty social issues. But the works do show very convincingly how these artists have chosen to participate in social struggles and to incite dialogue about topics like racism and bigotry, which Stan Lee had identified as one of the world's deadliest ills back in 1968, and that have unfortunately characterized German popular opinion since the large waves of refugees began arriving in 2015. These artists have recognized these issues as intersecting with their own lives, and have recognized their work with comics as a possible and powerful method to influence other world citizens to activate their relational, critical, and responsible way of reading the world. Can we really say, however, that these members of the dominant culture develop an autonomous agency in their characters? Many readers would have different views. I hope you have seen, however, over the course of this talk that they have deployed their inspired expression of citizenship as a means for understanding the situation of another and as a way to connect individuals through connected stories. They are not trying to replace or displace the voices, but only to amplify them through art. Thank you. I do have the three graphic novels above me, so if anyone wants to take a closer look inside any of those.
A lot of time for questions,
So I have a question. So all of these seem to be kind of on the left liberal side of the political spectrum. I'm wondering if would it be possible to do a similar talk? Are there any comics or graphic novels that are kind of more on the right side? Do you know anything about that?
I'd like to, are you talking about the same topic?
Well, or any topics. I mean, is it the case that the comic artists in Germany working today are sort of more on the left liberal side, or are there actually comic artists who are, neo-Nazi comic artists? Does that exist?
I can think of some that thematize, maybe, I don't think directly of neo-Nazi topics, but I don't know that the artists are on that side of the spectrum themselves. I don't know if anyone will admit to, like, here's a neo-Nazi comic and I'm going to print it and sell it. So I have to look into that. You're right, but I also think these concepts that are framed in arts activism and I mean, those are kind of left-leaning sort of ideas too, so that's probably why these fit so well into it. But I would have to look, what's coming from the other side? What are the other voices? There's one that I could think of called Vice of Europa, which is about, it's a neo-Nazi kind of recruitment, tells the story of neo-Nazi recruitment, but again, I haven't looked at it for a while. I don't think the authors are from that side. I think they're shedding light on that. But that's a good question to look into. You're right, it kind of a counter.
Well, because one of the points that you had at the beginning was kind of critiquing contemporary comics for being a little too left liberal.
That was the Comicscape, is that what you mean? Right. So that's also an American context, which I realize. And I would have to find, again, the corresponding German context, I guess. But that was in response to, I mean, if you're interested in American comics at all, I'm not that much, but I looked into a lot for this talk. They have become, I guess, there's a criticism out there that they've also become they're really social justice texts now, and they're liberal, they're on that side. We want, what the guy there said, they don't want to lose jobs because that's not what they believe in. They just want to make comics. They don't want to be labeled as anti-liberal or anti-social justice. So that's a debate that's ongoing right now, and I'd have to really see, is there an analogous one in Germany that which I didn't do for this, but I could look at you if you have any, if you know of any, it would kind of be from the other side.
Maybe you have to look at the right sides, not like the mainstream sides, right? Not from like any political people or all of the comic makers. I don't think that would make those comics.
That's what I mean.
Right,
Yeah,
but have people like to the sides that you I don't know, maybe British power.
The same thing's running through America, where we've got a number of more nationals, not necessarily neo-Nazi, but national. And
yeah.
there are some in Germany. There are more actually in Sweden and Finland, that are being self-published.
That's what it would have to be.
Some cases marketed threats.
Yeah, or when, the webcomics are not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I just, I remember that when the National Socialist Underground, that right-wing terrorist organization, they, when it became public that had happened and killed 10, mostly Turkish people, for being terrorists, I believe they published on the web, a Pink Panther video. It was kind of a right-wing Pink Panther video. Just, I've never watched it. It would be hard. I imagine there probably are some.
I would think so. And I've never, obviously I wasn't looking at that from this, but it's a good thing to look into. There's one that I can think of, and definitely not from the right side, but Friends is, we have it in the Kutch library, but it's a true, based on a true story about a Klan meeting in Baden-Württemberg, in one of the very conservative area of Germany, and it's really, really funny. It's making fun of us because they get lost, they can't find the Klan meeting, they get attacked by a dog, and all kinds of things while they're trying to get to the Klan meeting. So it's one of the students, I have them present on comics that we're not covering in class, somebody presented on that one, and I had read it before that. So again, it's not so from a Klansman, but it's critiquing that, giving fun of it. I'll look into, because like you mentioned, like I found out as I was preparing, there is this pretty hot debate going on right now. Like, you have to be a social justice, you have to use social justice themes to be successful in comics, or you ostracized if you don't. So I think we'll look into transferring that to Germany and see what's going on there.
What I'd ask you is, I'm not aware of the size of the publishing industry for comics in Germany, because